So let me attempt to explain, hopefully briefly, about the reference that I made in terms of the World King dominions and their decree or process or methodology of power toward other nations. So let me first refer back to the post. It was just kind of being introduced, giving an outline of a way or different tools that certain leadership on the world stage utilizes against other nations. And so like military tariff sanctions, expansion, and resources. And so what I had said was, imagine that these measures were outlined as the mechanisms confessed as power from King Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus in the scriptures. Sure, it's an outline of world dominion power, but then why have any of the rest of scripture? Why would there be any of the rest of scripture if the world powers just rely on the king power the story of God was seeking to transform? Why even have God then? Because it seemed this suggestion of powers along these lines should just continue to be inflicted upon nations. Or is that the only approach toward other nations? So the exposure of these measures serves as a type of mapping of dominions so that people could begin to understand world power distinct from transformative alternative methods. Imagine not even attempting other methods because one is addicted to world power set against God. So what I mean there is that a lot of the scriptures, a lot of the storyline of the scriptures culminate in mapping out what's going on internally within powers of kingdoms. And so that's like a massive template of the whole story. It shows from the ground level how people get, misconstrued or skewed away from their spiritual path, how it develops into difficulties relating to relationships, how that turns into improper competing value systems, and then tensions within systems, and then various forms of power over other systems, and then certain type of animated powers intensified and accumulated through hostilities among nations. So it becomes this sense of trying to solve for spiritual alignment unto God, a freedom from kingdoms, and understanding differentiating stages of world dominion and methodologies to then take measures to properly negotiate between nations, free up the world kingdoms and have them in reference to a heavenly kingdom in line with life and God and whatnot, right? So the question here, as people are getting into these battles on the world stage, is why not just resolve these tensions, continue to attempt resolving tensions utilizing these world power methods. But what's interesting about it, and so this is what I was bringing out, is okay, sure, you can outline world power methods that are very similar to the very enemies of the way of God in scripture as it's revealed. But then why cloak it in this imagery of God? Why say that you're advocating for some type of freedom unto God when it's simply just the use of world kingdom dominion? So I kind of wanted to go into that even more. I think the question that comes up, I've seen this in the past, is people then say, well, does that mean we never defend ourselves? Does that mean we never utilize these types of kingdom power methods against other competing kingdoms? So then it kind of gets into these questions of like pacifism, or what is it that Jesus did, or what kind of approaches then do we have? And I think a lot can be supposed along those lines. There's a lot of theological discussions along those lines. But I think a simple measure is, once we recognize the ways that kingdoms function, you should also take every opportunity to try other things, because the warning is that if you become that type of power unto yourself, you set yourself up for the pattern of kingdom collapse. So this is also why in the story, kingdoms would transfer to other kingdom powers, and over time became aware that there was like an internal favor of like a usefulness to then adhere to a spiritual receptivity. And so it would cause kingdoms and powers to seek for those that could help them discern between discussions and other methods, because their tendency was just to refer to these other types of power dominion methods. So over time, there became this sense where kingdoms would trade out the fullness of their conflict and collapse and be absorbed into other kingdoms, and that would just continue. And so what you kind of find, which develops eventually in the story, so you go from like Genesis in the ground level, developing into systems, and then we go through the stage of the kings rising to power. And then we get a picture through like the stage of King Solomon and the rise of his power, what's going on externally and internally. And then we get the beginnings of the collapse of his kingdom, because he ultimately takes on these similar world dominion powers. And so the kingdom splits, and then they have groups warring against each other. Eventually then, as they relinquish their connection to spiritual guidance, they then just fully become committed to hostilities against each other. Eventually then these behaviors and the world networks that become involved in it cause them to become absorbed into other kingdoms. They get absorbed into other kingdoms. And then, so this is where some portions of Israel get absorbed into Assyria and whatnot, and then in some of the surrounding nations, and then some portions of like Judah, the other side of Israel, get absorbed into what they call Babylonian captivity. Through that stage, there's preserved what they call the remnant, or like a small portion of those that still are trying to adhere to the spiritual distinction in the midst of these kingdom dominions. So it's through that, the remnant portion within the world dominion, that begins to have this very vulnerable negotiation on the world stage to preserve a sense of God distinction in the midst of these world powers. So at the stage where they are drawn into Babylonian captivity, of which these sections of the story start to develop what's happening in the text near kind of like the end of what people will call the Hebrew text or the Old Testament. And it basically will end up, what basically would happen is, so there's the Babylonian captivity, the remnant within that negotiates, and then Babylon is taken over by another group, Cyrus, the Medes and the Persians, overthrow Babylon, and then they take captivity of the remnant, not really intentionally seeming to have that in mind to do, but it just through different circumstances, it ends up happening. And so then it raises their awareness to some things, so they end up going ahead and taking them captive, like some of the spiritual, I guess you would say, I don't know if you'd say leader, because they were kind of in a vulnerable position, spiritual counsel, I guess. And so then through that, would bring them into captivity, and that's the stage of Cyrus. And then they're in their dominion, and then they also bring into captivity some of the other, the remnant, what they call the remnant. And so then that's the stage where under Cyrus, they then make these deals, these vulnerable deals, and they begin to have permission to start rebuilding the temple through connections to Cyrus. And so then that's when they start rebuilding the temple. They're still under the reign of Cyrus. And there's a lot that could be studied there, because this is also the beginning of the stage where over time they become dependent on keeping the temple going through the reign of Cyrus. And so even though it's kind of fulfilling some of the stages where God had promised that if, there had been a remnant or those that would still adhere to God, that he would bring them through and there would be a sense for rebuilding. And there's a need for the rebuilding if you see like the ultimate story where it kind of culminates in needing to have a stage of restabilizing the temple unto the world powers. And then through that, Jesus fulfills these other mechanisms in relation to that. But anyway, to just simplify it, this is a stage then of Babylon and then Cyrus, and then that holds that space of Cyrus, the world powers, over the temple. Then it kind of ends there, but then there's all of these years in between that are not really in scripture. This big chunk of time where you could see, like in Jewish literature, there's a lot that goes on there, which develops other conflicts and other things that happen on the world stage. Then we're introduced to what's called like the New Testament on that stage. And then we get a picture of what's starting to happen with this relationship, because then it transfers the powers, the world dominion transfers. And eventually now it switches from Babylon to Cyrus, from other kingdoms. And then once it's the time of Jesus, then it's under the force of Rome as the world dominion power, still utilizing those same methods and transferences of power and whatnot. And the temple still has that relationship to the powers, the world powers. In some ways, this is what like Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be referring to when he's still trying to appeal to Trump to be what they call the Cyrus power, which is basically trying to categorize Trump as being a world dominion power and Israel being the distinctive spiritual animation on the world stage. Like the, I guess you would say like true distinction where God on the world stage. And so Benjamin Netanyahu still seems to be interpreting almost like a sense of the book of Daniel, where Daniel's like this spiritual distinction, spiritual council, or like even the book of Ezra, as under the dominion of world powers. You'll see that they then brought him in and seemed to tell him this story that you are Babylon, you are Cyrus, you are Rome, and then we're still playing the role of Judaism within the remnant of the temple. So you'll see that in the news. You'll see that they had said that when he came down, they were saying that he was Cyrus. And then this seems to also be where you'll have some Zionist groups still falling in line to that and believing this sense of that relationship of Cyrus unto Israel. And then that's where like this perpetuation of the Abrahamic call continues to enact the blessing on the world nations. And so that's where they get this like world power alignment with Israel. What's really peculiar about that, though, and so this is why it seems important to read this stage of, this is the story before it drops into the silent years in terms of the text, and then enters into like the stage of Jesus. So prior to that, then you have like the book of Daniel and Ezra. Coinciding with those are some of the prophets that are talking about this too. So those are just kind of the stage after the divided kingdom. And so here we are. So to just do a really simple summary, the remnant then from the portion of Israel that goes into or gets absorbed into Babylonian captivity goes through stages where at some level they're just simply expected to adhere to the methodologies and the practices of the Babylonian power at the time, which includes things like bowing and worshiping and just every other thing involved in whatever that compliance and absorption into that system is. So then it introduces these stories where there's like a faithful few that refuse to do that, and they still want to preserve this distinction of connection to God, as distinct from full surrender to the Babylonian kingdom. And so they're in captivity and they're still seeking to hold to that distinction of God. Others kind of get word of things going on, and so some of them get brought in for questioning And so they go through this stage where there's these really vulnerable negotiations. Some of them are sentenced to being burned in these fires, basically like a sentencing or a punishment from the system. And then this is like the story that people might be familiar with. It's called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Some of these, they were placed into this fire, and this spiritual intervention happens where they, it doesn't work. Like they're not burned, and then they see this other figure in there with them. Like it's kind of being told as though like an angel or a spirit intervenes and protects them from being burned up. It then is revealed to the leadership that this happened. And so then it gets his attention, and he's like, peculiar, you know? Then to him, he's kind of like, okay, this isn't the run-of-the-mill rebellion. There's a spiritual distinction here. So this story serves as portraying through like the old storytelling that there was a spiritual distinction here that caught the attention of the system leader. He then, through this, draws some of them to his council and wants to hear more about it. So what do you believe in? What's your spiritual, what is your spiritual distinction? What do you believe in? So then this is where they, through this whole vulnerable experience, have a seat at the table to start negotiating and explaining to him about their beliefs and whatnot. Once the king is made aware that there's a spiritual distinction here, and this is kind of a pattern, you know, like where it portrays how God works, a certain form of vulnerability, a recognition. Once there's an embedded recognition, then there's like a level of responsibility. So after the king is aware of them and he understands some of the distinction of what they're about, he undergoes these experiences in his life of being challenged. His life is interrupted. There's something about it that stirs his mind. He can't sleep. He calls in and he's seeking for spiritual guidance. He has these various dreams. And it's another vulnerable situation where one of these people, like Daniel, he's very much aware that he has to kind of say what the king wants to hear, or he could be punished. But he also has to be true to the spiritual calling on his life. And so he gets called in among other seers and different ones, and they're asked to interpret these dreams. And so he basically interprets the dreams as kind of not the best future for the king and the kingdom. But it's honest, and at some degree, the king seems to have some level of respect for like recognizing that this is like a pattern, you know? But then he kind of gets a little contentious about it. And he then is like resistant to them, or, you know, there's an animosity. But at this stage that there's already kind of this embedded critique into his experience, like he should have some level of receptive responsibility. He persists in rejecting that spiritual distinction initially. And so then God allows him to be surrendered to his own like depraved mind, and he goes crazy. So then he goes crazy for a little while until he's kind of put in check and brought low to the ground. And it's through that time where he eventually then seeks for this like guidance and connection to Daniel, and he gets the spiritual guidance, and so it brings a level of rest to him. And so what it functions as is he begins to realize the only rest that he has as a distinctive connection is through the Spirit of God that is working through Daniel. So he eventually surrenders and like succumbs to it a little bit reluctantly. Reluctantly, because he'd been incredibly brought low to his own abilities. And, one might even say, well, if God's able to do that, why didn't God just like get rid of him or get rid of all of this stuff? Why doesn't, it's like a common question that people have is like, why doesn't God just, if he can kind of intervene, why doesn't he like just ultimately intervene and change everything? What you find in the story is that there's something, the story kind of reads like throughout it that God is functioning through transforming the unit body of creation through mechanisms within it in order to preserve it. It's as though God in the story is having to enter into the ways that the whole unit of creation had become skewed in order to like preserve it through these types of like surgical approaches to preserve it and transform it from within. As though, well, that can be kind of a side conversation later as to like, why would God do that? Why would God take that approach? But basically a simple suggestion is that it's to preserve the portions, to work through transforming them rather than ridding them, or the assumption that God would just override everything in the sense to just create another type of power over dominion over change mechanisms. There's more to that, and I'll maybe add an application at the end of this. But so getting back to the story, he's very humbled, and so he's kind of like caught between probably a sense of animosity that he'd been very humbled in that sense, and still wanting to, if he had his own ultimate power, resume business as usual in the way and the power that he used to. But he's been very humbled, and so he's made to position into connection and recognition of Daniel and the Spirit of God. And that's the respite. That's like the narrow path of redirecting that he's given. And so eventually then through this, you get him making these proclamations eventually after this type of confession. So it says, and I'll just kind of go through some basic points of it. What Daniel had communicated to him: "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people, and you will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. My sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. So this is King Nebuchadnezzar. So he went through this time where he was extremely humbled. And then this is when he's finally proclaiming this. And he says, his dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the kings of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. And no one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in his pride he is able to humble. So at this time, what this kind of functions as is showing that he's brought into this sense where he has to recognize this spiritual distinction, and he then embeds that spiritual distinction into and proclaims from where he's situated that is a uniqueness of God and a unique power of God unto the dominion of the heavens beyond the kings of the earth. So then at that time, he goes through a level of, through this adherence, he then develops a level of success unto his kingdom as he is adhering to growing in these types of spiritual connections and distinctions. What you find at the same time, though, is that he doesn't entirely change. He functions through his kingdom power and a receptivity to some of this spiritual distinction going on. And so it's kind of growing together, because ultimately then eventually he's still in his ways and he's still enacting some of these various methods and whatnot. So then you get this stage, and this is kind of a common story called the handwriting on the wall, So after he then developed some levels of success, which also, now that I'm rereading this reminds me of the story I just reread about King Saul, where King Saul then enters into recognizing his error. And once he kind of recognizes some of the error and he's made aware of like not fully correcting measures with Jonathan, and then like not fully making corrections of the trajectory. Once there's that recognition, then he goes through a time of developing throughout his similar measures and both this like lingering, growing awareness, but also still going in his same way. Does seem to be a pattern with some of these things, because then ultimately King Saul then goes into his own destruction because he's still functioning in his own power. So that's what you similarly get here, because then next, after he goes through a stage of just redeveloping himself in his own power in connection to the recognition of this spiritual distinction internally, he then gets critiqued as at this time in this story called The Handwriting on the Wall. So he was at this banquet with many people. Belshazzar was drinking his wine. He gave orders to bring in the gold and the silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. They're wining and dining and they're having this party. And then it says, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand, appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought, and said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. So to skip forward in the story, eventually he calls various ones in. He's trying to seek guidance for what is this writing on this wall. And so through various encounters, then eventually he stumbles upon Daniel, which then is able to interpret it. And then it basically, so the words are mene tekel parsin, and he interprets it as saying, this is what the words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So then this begins the stage where, so then at this point it says, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Medes took over the kingdom at the age of 62. There's another portion that was actually really important to read that I missed as after I was telling the story previous, when they were first brought into captivity and some of the men were then brought into the fiery furnace, and then there was like a spiritual intervention. So after that first episode of like recognition between Nebuchadnezzar and some of these men, he then, after the awareness that something spiritually distinctive is happening here, he then makes this important statement. So this is in chapter 3. It says, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And then this is when Nebuchadnezzar says, "To the peoples, nations, and men, to every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation." And so this is where he starts to combine kingdom powers with this sense of his initial exposure to the spiritual distinction and the blessings for it. So he merges those together, the kingdom power and the associated blessing. And it's important to note this because this portion in this methodology is what continues to be a part of the world power dominion and interpretations of trying to utilize that blessing and pull to themselves for their own power and mechanisms, justifying it through God eventually. Because they start having this mixed version of God and kingdom power dominion. So to revisit that, he's basically saying, he's merging the idea of the power of God and saying that through his kingdom power, he'll protect the distinction of this God by, attacking other nations that would say anything different and cutting them into pieces and burning their houses and turning the place into a pile of rubble. And then he merges this by saying no other God can save in this way. But at this point, it's like a lowercase God, so it's in the scripture associating that isn't a method of God. So then that's interesting to note because then later he continues in the sense of merging this type of blessing, but then becomes confronted. And so then that's when Nebuchadnezzar becomes confronted in his power and needing to recognize and adhere and surrender more to the methods and the distinction of God. So then that's when it gets into the story where he's humbled greatly to where he realizes that he isn't the only power, so he at this time is trying to be the power over the idea of God and the distinctive measure of God, and hadn't had any type of change in terms of the methods or methodologies on the world stage among other nations. So then he becomes humbled, and then that's when he makes that confession that it's God's dominion that is eternal, that endures from generation to generation. And what's interesting here, though, is you still just keep getting confessions that are not really the full revelation of the attributes of God, but come out of the mouth of a king that is losing his power. And so he says, all peoples of the earth I regarded as nothing. God does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth, and no one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" Because he's humbled. So it's kind of an interesting thing to consider too, that he is well, if I don't get my way of my power, God now seems like nothing. But he also adheres to this felt sense that these invisible forces that are humbling him, or that don't, times are shifting and he's not in alignment with it because he's trying to preserve his own power. And so he's getting humbled. And so he's feeling like God doesn't care about people, or, because that's the way he tries to concern himself with people. It's more of a reflection of him. He doesn't care about people. He does what he wants for himself. And if that type of dominion is threatened, he feels like he loses the distinction of what favor is. But anyway, so Nebuchadnezzar goes through this stage of being humbled. He goes through stages where he develops some sort of adherence to some level of benefit, and then the next king in line of this like perpetuation of Nebuchadnezzar is then doesn't really care about any distinctive aspect of this spiritual connection, and then that's when his kingdom is taken from him. Also similar to the story of Solomon, Solomon getting humbled, but then his kingdom is still most of it taken from him, but it happens through his son that doesn't seem to have any spiritual receptivity. So then the story carries forth. So what you start to find at this stage is that this distinctive remnant of like spiritual guidance happens through a few speaking unto and having vulnerable negotiations within these kingdom authorities. And so it continues as a kingdom authority and internal vulnerable discussions. So now it's switched over to the kingdom under Cyrus. Initially, they don't recognize the distinction of Daniel, and so they sentence him, as they come in and conquer the place and take over the place, they sentence him to being thrown into a den of lions. He's thrown into the den of lions, and he's protected. So they come back and they realize they didn't devour him. And so it's like a similar situation with Nebuchadnezzar, where their sentencing then doesn't follow through the way they thought, and so it gets their attention, so they recognize the spiritual distinction. And so through that spiritual distinction, it produces a similar story as them drawing into their life this connection with this spiritual type council. And so then this is what the King Darius under, like the Medes and the Persians under the reign of Cyrus, he says, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Even though there's a sense of receptivity, they still function through their power and dominion, and so they expect a certain type of adherence of Daniel to them, and so he's still caught up in these really vulnerable negotiations. So then eventually it switches over into the book of Ezra, where they get to the point where they're able to negotiate under the dominion of Cyrus to rebuild their temple and to utilize a certain form of taxes to rebuild the temple. And so at this stage, you're beginning to see that they have it in mind to rebuild in a type of imagery of David's kingdom and Solomon's kingdom. So that's kind of the imagery that they have in mind, is to regenerate in that sense. But they're revisiting the idea of what a corrective measure could be. And so they're imagining to themselves that once they're starting to rebuild, they will be careful not to. So this is where it gets into where they say they'd be careful not to marry foreign wives and things along those lines, which is interesting because some people seem to interpret that as accurate, as in their mind, basically it's kind of saying they're interpreting the reason for the collapse of Solomon's kingdom because they married out and because they didn't maintain a type of purity, which in some ways you could look at that as because they were saying they wouldn't have foreign wives. And that is an association with that they wouldn't draw into their kingdom alliances of foreign wives and idolatry, which was a part of confronting Solomon about, because it was through the requirements associated through these alliances of these foreign wives that brought in idolatry, and the idolatry involved horrific things that eventually became merging the idea and the reflection of God with child sacrifice and other types of association. So I think it's just important to note that it isn't just this idea of like ethnic purity as much as the idea of foreign wives was associated with idolatry and requirements of participation in types of idolatry to serve a form of preserving alliance with other nations. And it's also important to recognize that it's extreme idolatry. It's not just these weird cultural differences. I think it's just so important to say that, because when people read on the surface level of the scriptures, they're imagining like ethnic, racial divides and like a purity form and any type of cultural difference as like the extreme form of idolatry. And so through some of those measures, they just end up building unto themselves something that eventually isn't really necessarily responsive to God, nor responsive to like building relationships. So at this time, though, in the book of Ezra, it portrays when they have this developed relationship with the system under Cyrus and the tax base, and then that is what funds the developing of the temple, or much of it. And that's important to note too, because later, eventually, Jesus is going to be the one critiquing this whole system that over time and over generations develops. The relationship of the temple through the taxes, through Cyrus and whatnot. What becomes vulnerable here is that some of the other kingdoms and nations that are at war with, there's still unresolved conflict, because every kingdom is going to have that vulnerability of other kingdoms. One of the kings gets this letter basically kind of warning those that are associating with these agreements developing within now, like those that are rebuilding Jerusalem and whatnot. He basically warns them that the king should know that the Jews who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and the royal revenue will suffer. Anyway, there's more and more that comes, but basically this is probably one of those that were at odds with Jerusalem, and also associated with those not being able to have access to an inclusivity with what's happening with the restoration of Jerusalem. And so that kind of goes into all of this unresolved tension where, in retrospect, maybe they should have had more inclusivity, because their associations with the world powers also was claiming that they would have dominion over other nations too. So you could see how it would be a threat to other nations if they made these sort of alliances. So there's just a lot of vulnerabilities going on there. And so this person is claiming, that this is a vulnerability to kings, because ultimately in the nucleus of what the temple represents is to transition the way that taxes on the world stage are used, and transition the way that tribute and things along those lines are obtained through the kingdoms. I mean, in the sense of what it stands for. And so you can kind of see this as tension between groups where they're continuing to negotiate and filling this vulnerability, which is interesting because even on the world stage, people often say that, like, if we really functioned through God, we would just be vulnerable to other groups that we're vulnerable to. And so people are vying for a type of adherence and alliances to the world powers so that they could, they might say protect them, but also weaponize attacks against their opposition and whatnot. What seems to be the outcome of this, though, is that they make deals and they realize there's a vulnerability. And so instead, the king then makes a deal with the work of the temple that essentially kind of makes them over time dependent on the tribute of the kings and the process and the way of the kings through these mechanisms of continuing and preserving tribute and tithe and whatnot, in such a way that over time seems to actually undermine the transformative approach of the money system unto the temple. And so then one of the kings says, "Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices and let its foundations be laid. It is to be," so then they kind of talk about how it's going to be built and whatnot. "And the costs are to be paid by the royal treasury. Also the gold, silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple, be returned." Skip forward. He encourages them to protect them from other measures and interference of this rebuilding. "And moreover, I hereby decree that you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. The expenses of these men are to be paid out of the royal treasury for the revenues of Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for offerings to the God of heaven, all these other like salt, wine, oil, requested by the priests in Jerusalem must be given them daily without fail, so that they may make these offerings." So basically the offerings and the support and the payment for keeping the temple going are offered through these mechanisms. And then furthermore, "I decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house. He is to be lifted up and impaled on it. And for this crime, his house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy this temple in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence." What you find going on here is that because of some of these vulnerabilities, they really kind of intensify a certain type of ideology of adherence to certain ideas of the temple. But in some ways, so it preserves a type of ideology, but it's not really functioning internally through the mechanisms or the protocols in that sense. And it's over time becoming very dependent on the powers of the world kingdoms to both provide the services for the temple and the payment for the temple, and of which over time requires that it says that you basically then from the temple you pray for the success of the world kingdom. So they become like dependent on the mechanisms of the world kingdom. What you find at this time is there's this difficulty in transforming the mechanisms of the world dominion. You'd seen it like Nebuchadnezzar made his decrees and proclamations, merging it with a type of likeness of God, and Cyrus under his leadership did something similar, which also then internalized control from the world system over the temple and its mechanisms, and it only served mostly as like a likeness of these ideas, but functioning through the world power system. Part of the intensity that amongst the temple that grows and develops too is like a competing to even become more and more solidified in an ideology against other opposition, because now it's set within weaponizing strategies against world kingdoms. It's this huge conundrum that starts to happen. And that's not to say that internally there weren't like certain groups that were not really a part of all of the establishment that were adhering to their own spiritual seeking and guidance, but that it was very much an occupying force at that time, and an occupying force over what the temple and a spiritual transformative approach would be. And it sets it up as though the temple cannot be a transformative approach functioning to transform world kingdoms at this point. They had become nearly unable to become a transformative mechanism into world kingdoms now. They are now dependent on those methodologies to have a likeness of being preserved. It's important to see this conundrum, because then this is part of what's happening at the time of Jesus. So Jesus then has to, if he is going to return to a sense of revealing spiritual freedom and return to a notion that could set in motion transforming kingdom powers and methodologies, the whole thing kind of needs to be transformed and confronted. And so one of the things that Jesus ends up doing is basically confronting this decree that is like basically set up Like Nebuchadnezzar kind of, as you recall, connected these decrees that continue in perpetuation as a type of God. Like the world dominion kingdoms are the God. They're playing God in the world dominion. And this is how they control world power. And Jesus then comes in, and because of these effects of the establishment of the temple in relation to Rome at the time, which is the world power, has to do this vulnerable work to transform all of that and to get back into an alignment that can actually transform world kingdom dominion powers. You see, some of what Jesus actually accomplishes is that he breaks that decree. He becomes made an example of the world powers, set upon and like it says, impaled or, raised from the ground to be made an example of as like the punishment from the world powers. You kind of see during the different stages of the world powers, their punishment is very similar. It's a very dominion over people, death, destruction, being made an example for fear and terror over other groups. And but at the time, so it's basically whatever the like system punishment is for any type of quote unquote competing gods, because they would even see other kings as competing gods. And part of it was that they would also make proclamations like, we are kingdom gods and we are perfect, and our precepts and our decrees are perfect, therefore we never go back on our word. We are the reigning gods on the earth. So they would never go back on their word. They wouldn't break their decree for the most part. So Jesus enters into this conundrum, and he basically then breaks that decree by being sentenced by the system to be made the example. And so through this, then, to them, he's just any old other person that would try to rebel against the system. But the story reads as though Jesus was distinct. He had a spiritual distinction, similar to like Daniel or various ones. And he was challenging the system in relation to its control also over the temple. Seeing then that the temple had also become occupied by the powers of the kingdom, and had difficulty or were unable to transform the kingdom or the temple into a form of spiritual freedom unto the world powers. So that's how you can kind of see how the story connects. And he does come under the sentencing of the system, but it's also like set up by those in the establishment of the temple, because it portrays this connection that they begin to have for self-preservation. And so it's kind of lining up the very thing that it had said, like we work together for the preservation of this dominion. And so this is what Jesus is seeking to transform, as I was saying. And Jesus even brings up the idea when he says like that he talks to Peter, and it's this whole thing, and I don't want to get off on another whole like explanation. There's a lot to like work through here and interpret, but there is this point where he says, they ask him, because there's this whole intersecting of confrontation having to do with the tribute, the tax, the temple, the ideology, the kingdom, the relationship to the temple establishment, world dominion, and him, this like trying to bring in the corrective spirit of it. And so he's not trying to, it's also one of those surgical stances. He's not trying to topple all of it or do away with all of it. He's trying to fulfill it and realign it to what it needs to be, and to free it, because it also had become occupying force against the other Jewish people and other groups in the vicinity who were then becoming oppressed and hindered by this connection of the temple establishment, in connection to the world powers, in connection to their tribute that they were getting, and then the taxes that they were collecting, and how it was fueling the temple system in relation to the world powers, in relation to being at odds with the spiritual transformation of God. And so they come to him and they ask him about, does he pay tribute to the temple? And they're trying to get him to deny the temple. They're trying to get him to falsely represent the temple so that he just seems like another person that's at odds with the temple. Because they have this grown ideological sense that they are purely preserving the temple order. And they can feel that Jesus is calling them out about it, about the spirit of what it's actually about. So it becomes this religious tension. And so they're trying to seek for ways to have Jesus corrupt the teachings of the temple. What's difficult there is that the teachings of the temple had already been corrupted. And so he's kind of trapped in this sense where he either denies paying to the temple or he pays to the temple and concurs with the world powers and how they function. And so they come to him and they ask him, like, Peter, does your leader here that you guys are all thinking is some kind of a Messiah or spiritual anointed transition, does he pay taxes or tribute to the temple? And then Peter's like, do we? Like, Jesus, what would you say? Like, do we? Because they also know that it's corrupt. Like, it's something they talk about because they feel like the system is corrupt. And so then Jesus says something to the effect of, well, do kings of the world collect tribute from their own sons or from others? And then Peter, knowing, because they're supposed to, through their traditions, be distinct from the kingdoms of the world, and he says, from others. Like, kingdoms of the world collect tribute and plunder from others. And then that's how they fuel their kingdoms, basically. And then Jesus says, oh, okay, then we are exempt. And so it's kind of interesting there because it's kind of like Jesus is saying to them, aren't you getting your payments from kingdom plunder, just like world kingdoms? And so, of course, they're going to be pissed because that's true. And it makes them wrong, spiritually wrong. And then he says, oh, but so that we're not offending various ones in terms of the temple requirements, let's pay the temple tax. And then what's even more interesting here that would even critique them even more and probably get them upset, because if this is like a religious discussion, he says, Peter, go down to the river and in the fish's mouth there'll be this coin, and it's like an old coin. And he says, use that to pay for me and you. And so they go and they get this coin, and it's an old coin, which is like in the form of how they would originally, through the authentic protocol, pay the temple tax. And he says, pay that for you and me. And what seems like the connotation there is because in some of the old way, when they would pay the temple tax, when they would share, when there was one that would cover two people, it gives a connotation to the ransom money, which is like a spiritual, like a form of paying unto like some of the atonement money, the ransom money. And it also in the protocol for doing that says like various ones pay the same, no more or no less. They each pay half. And so one coin will serve two people. And so that even seems like more of a dig, because what also seems to happen there is that they started to, there became other types of payment. They were getting more payment. And it's hard to say whether they were or weren't doing that other. There were different types of payment. There were different types of tithe and payment and tax. But also what's different there is he doesn't pay from the present currency. He pays from a coin that was found in a river. So just so many things that he bypasses there. He's not paying into the same system. And this isn't like a purity argument. It's not the sense of like, don't ever participate in the market or this or that. He's uniquely just critiquing the purity standard, the seeming gridlock of the religious authorities at the time to portray themselves as abiding in a purity standard, governing over the temple, and as like the spokespeople of God. And so that's why Jesus seems to be having more of like a resistance on all fronts to that power of the money system in relation to the temple, in relation to guarding and managing the powers of the world against other nations and against other people, even their own people. And so it's a really peculiar discussion that's going on there. Eventually, so I think at this point, I'm going to leave it at that, because then it goes into the whole conundrum of like, what was Jesus actually doing? And part of his death had to do with like seemingly like critiquing this kingdom rule decree in relation to balancing the accounts of the world system. And what it also seems to be the connotation there is that one of the mechanisms that God had prescribed for the work of the temple in relation to like managing, like even at the very least, when they did take upon themselves a king of their own, one way to at least manage the connections with the kingdom was like the blood accounts and the ransom money and some of these things. So even at the time of David, King David, he was made susceptible to improperly waging war on people and misusing the functions of the temple in relation to his own warfare dynamics and his own projections and his own strategies. Because to be in line with God, they had to be in line with gauging the times of like the blood accounts and where God was in terms of negotiating the direction of the path of like staying within a certain form of strategizing, how would I say this? Like only going forward into types of defense in relation to unraveling prior offense that they hadn't developed. And so there was a certain type of unique strategy in relation to the temple. And so even when there was a concession as to having a king, he was also portraying that this approach of the temple in relation to the world powers was not adhering to the method and strategy of God involving the temple. And so even at the very least, it was basically kind of being portrayed that they're just misusing a likeness of the temple and just using world method powers. And that even if there were a transition, so here's where it might be applicable for people if they're imagining what would be a transition then, just to become like absolutely vulnerable to like world kingdoms and not negotiate at all when there's like warfare and conflict. It's not necessarily saying that. I mean, there is like a stance of non-aggression and whatnot that Jesus had in terms of correcting the spiritual alignment and being responsive. And you have to go into a sense of that really refined spiritual critique in order to relieve the religious powers from their false authority. But there are mechanisms of concession for degrees away from improper power and dominion methodologies on the world stage. So then that would look like transitions of basically not seeking for ultimate power, not just going through the protocol of the methods of world kingdoms and the power over, but negotiations, gauging the time, the accurate level of threat, reducing the level of threat, just all the reasonable relational dynamics and not producing hostilities or technicalities to then function through. And there should be, like attributes of proper, fair strategies and protocols and whatnot. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. There was a lot to say there. And let's see. I don't know. Was there a better way to wrap this up? There are other things to think about in terms of like what Jesus was doing and the mechanisms. But this is going on to over an hour, so I'm going to leave it at that for now.